When you think about superhero game, Iron Man isn't exactly the first thing that pops into your head. Probably not the second, third, or fourth thing either. No, those spots are likely going to be taken by Spider-Man, Batman, Infamous, and Prototype, but not Iron Man, which I find odd because Iron Man isn't your average superhero. He doesn't just chuck a shield around and hit people in the face, limiting options in a video game medium. Iron Man is easily the most versatile hero out there. He can hack, he can fight from afar, he can fight up close, he can fly, he can go incredibly fast, even underwater, he can do detective work, he even has connections in government with his influence as Tony Stark, and is totally free of financial restriction. And unlike Superman, he's not ridiculously over-proficient in any of these fields. He's just good at all of them. This versatility allows for a huge amount of possible gameplay types: stealth, ranged combat, melee combat, hacking, crafting, flying, detective puzzles. He is a goldmine of video game potential that simply hasn't been dug into. That's not to say there haven't been attempts though. There have been multiple Iron Man video games in the past, which I'm sure is a surprise to many, but they weren't very good. Poor combat, awful controls, lazy mission design, hilariously bad stories. None of this is any surprise because each of them was a movie licensed game. There were 3 games as far as I know based off the first movie. Iron Man Wii and DS were extremely enjoyable games in my opinion, and the best video game treatment the character has ever seen, yet not one of them earned above a 60 on Metacritic. The Wii version got a 15% from the official Nintendo magazine, which is one of the lowest scores they've ever awarded. Iron Man for Xbox and PS3 was awarded the worst game everyone played award for 2008. In my opinion, it was more on the okay side of things, but not a bad game, not like Iron Man 2. Iron Man 2 for the DS was once again really good, but the Wii, Xbox, and PS3 versions didn't fare so well. I quote, "The experience felt like a PS1 game, and it should be thrilling and fun to take to the sky in a super-powered battlesuit, but Iron Man 2 crashes to the earth with a dull thud." At least the Xbox and PS3 games had a fairly enjoyable destruction system, and made an attempt at a more in-depth progression system. Did movie license games kill any chance of a studio having another crack at the character? I certainly hope not, and I do believe there's hope with Eidos Montreal's upcoming Avengers games. In this video, I'm going to be taking aspects from previous games and coming up with some stuff of my own, in an attempt to show that designing an Iron Man game isn't the impossible task it's been made out to be, despite myself never having designed a game before and my only qualification being that I really like Iron Man. So this ought to be quite fun. Just because there's never been an above average Iron Man game doesn't mean that Iron Man hasn't been in an above average game. Enter Just Cause 3. Blowing things up and Just Cause go hand in hand, which makes it more than appropriate for Iron Man's character. But that's not why we're here. The first of Just Cause 3's DLCs was called Sky Fortress, and the very first mission handed you a Bavarian wingsuit. Like the normal wingsuit, but capable of self-sustained flight. With the upgrades, it makes you the god of destruction that in my opinion the base game wasn't quite able to achieve. Straight off the bat, you can perform an unassisted takeoff, which you can then further accelerate with your limited boost supply. This recharges in air, meaning you can only maintain maximum speed for as long as you have available boost. With a tap of a button, you can dodge right, left, up, and down. The vertical rolls are capable of altering your direction effectively. If you're about to crash into something, an upwards roll is your best option if you want to maintain your speed. However, this still isn't the best method of redirecting your momentum. With the air brake, you can quickly sap your current momentum, reposition, and smash the boost down for a fairly efficient in-air redirection. For a less efficient redirect, you can keep the boost held down while changing direction to do the same thing much faster. The air brake is also capable of performing a clean landing. There's more. With the Bavarian wingsuit, SAM sights are capable of targeting you, but with a well-timed dodge roll, you can evade them. In bases with multiple anti-air cannons, you'll be torn to shreds, meaning you need to fly low to avoid their missiles. Rico is also threatened by anti-air drones on the mech island and flat cannons. With the default brake, separate from the air brake, you can close your wingsuit mid-air, putting you into a free fall. In this state, you can easily reposition and you'll no longer be targeted by SAM sights. When you're low enough, you can quickly redeploy the wingsuit and hold down the boost button for an easy shot on any given target. That brings me onto the shooting. The Bavarian wingsuit has missiles and a machine gun. Aiming is done with flight trajectory, which works perfectly thanks to the generous aim assist. Missiles auto-lock on after a short period, and the machine gun has such a large cone of fire that you'll be hitting your target once the reticle turns red, which allows you to take on enemy drones comfortably. Even in the water, you can hold the boost button to push you in a certain direction, and when you're on the surface, you can take off immediately. Everything Everything you want or need from Iron Man's flight is here in some form, and Just Cause 3 does this better than any of the official Iron Man games. To repurpose the wingsuit for Iron Man, the first and most obvious thing is making it feel more like a rocket than a wingsuit. Iron Man doesn't glide, he barrels through the air like a bullet. He should feel a lot heavier than Rico. The boost meter could also be there since it adds a degree of skill, but this should just be a juiced up version of normal flight. Iron Man also shouldn't be put out of action because he scraped a tree branch. He should be able to smash straight through small obstacles. Redirection should be far faster, done instead by turning off the thrusters, quickly repositioning mid-air, and then turning them on again. He should of course also be able to hover in the same way Rico can use his parachute. Just Cause 3 has it damn near perfect for its own purposes. In-flight combat is there, he can move comfortably within the water, there's a degree of skill added by the limited boost resource, and of course it looks fucking awesome. Few changes are needed to make it perfect for us. But of course, Rico has far more methods of destruction available than just the wingsuit guns, and with Iron Man being, well, Iron Man, it's high time we talked about weapons. Weaponry is a big topic for Iron Man, but I don't think it needs to be difficult at all, because previous games have already done it perfectly well. Iron Man Wii had a 3-weapon system that you could upgrade throughout the game. You had the minigun for smaller and more scattered targets like foot soldiers, you had the missiles for much bigger targets like tanks, and you had repulsors, which worked well enough against everything, but not as well as the minigun for smaller targets thanks to its low rate of fire, and not as well as the missiles against tanks thanks to its low damage. The problem I see is balancing. In Iron Man Wii, what stopped you from simply spamming missiles was limited ammo. Both the missiles and the minigun had a limited supply, and it was only the repulsors that were free of ammo restrictions. But you couldn't spam them either because you'd overload your weapon system. This 3-weapon system was perfectly good, but the thing is it only worked thanks to the game's mission-based structure. Ammo was balanced for a single mission, or for the time it takes the player to get to the next ammo drop. With any design but that, you can't really have ammo limitations, certainly not in an open world, because you never know how long the player would want to spend in the combat sandbox, and ammo refilling all the time is both boring and counterintuitive to the balancing, because if you can refill at leisure, nothing's to stop you from spamming all your missiles, refilling, coming back, and using all your missiles again. So if we're going with mission-based structure, then that might be good enough, but I don't really think that's living up to Iron Man's potential. I also think simply doing Iron Man Wii again is a little pointless. Open world is so good for superheroes because it gives them something tangible to protect or to restore. These are open world characters, and stories generally have one of two forms. Stop the area from being hurt, or bring the hurt area back to prosperity. You can either stop the evil act from ever happening, or reverse the evil act as much as you can. Some games like Ocarina of Time and Spider-Man Web of Shadows do both of these in the same game, but most Spider-Man games typically take the first route, and something like Just Cause and Batman Arkham does the second. Notice that in Just Cause and Batman Arkham you're allowed to blow stuff up. That's because it doesn't destroy immersion if you're causing chaos and using lethal tactics in a setting that has been taken over by the forces of evil. Well, most of the time. And let's be honest, Iron Man's at his best when he's knee-deep in it. This is why I think a peaceful New York setting would be inappropriate, and something like Just Cause would be much better. An area overrun with terrorists or AIM or the Maggia family. Bringing it back to weaponry, now that we've got an open world in which we're allowed to use all of our weapons, we need to balance appropriately. Cooldowns instead of limits make much more sense for open world, but if enemies can reliably deal some form of damage to you at any range that you can do damage to them, you don't even need cooldowns. You can just make weapons highly specialized. Instead of missiles being good against everything, perhaps make them noticeably less effective at taking out infantry, maybe due to them specifically being armor-piercing missiles, or because the infantry is too far spread out for the missiles to take them out efficiently. The minigun is ineffective versus more armored targets, and the repulsors have their own set of benefits and disadvantages. Our next problem is controls. In Iron Man Wii, you had to switch between the 3 major weapons when you wanted to use any of them. This wasn't an issue there because no encounters would ever require you to switch between weapons in an instant. Here, however, we're trying to make Iron Man a bit more exciting, so having each of these 3 weapons on a specific button I think is the way to go. Think Prototype 2. Just Cause 3 also did it this way, but with only 2 weapons. For Iron Man, if we're going off Just Cause's controls, we still have the circle or B button and L1 or left bumper button free, so either of those can work. I'm thinking square for repulsors, L1 for the minigun, and R1 for missiles. On mouse and keyboard, there's 100 good ways of doing this, but games still need to be functional on a pad. These 3 weapon types work great. The only problem is a lack of variety. Despite Iron Man being a walking armory, only 3 weapons is low by any game standards. So I absolutely think that stuff like the micro missiles, the unibeam, and the laser should be present as rechargeable attacks. Prototype is often forgotten as a superhero game, probably because Alex Mercer is about as close to being a hero as I am to being the Pope. Despite this, when it comes to making you feel like a human, it probably does it better than anything else out there. It had 5 weapon types and multiple attacks for each, which is far more varied than what we've got, to say the least. Because you could only have one equipped at a time, all of the combat controls were available for each one. So you had heavy attacks, light attacks, and combos. It was awesome. Obviously, we can't have a separate attack for holding down the minigun button, but for the repulsors and missiles, it makes sense to allow us to charge a heavy version, and for combo-like moves to be available if you can perform the right sequence of lights and heavies. Things like a Devastator in the form of a huge swarm of micro-missiles could be cool, and Mercer's classic bullet drop is all but iconic for Iron Man. You might want to have the drop as the default landing, but if you do that, you take all tension out of landing and accurate flying. There needs to be fall and impact damage to some degree. Same thing was true for the Spider-Man games. So I think the Iron Man drop should be something you have to time, like a roll in Mirror's Edge, or in the same way Rico can perform a safe landing by holding down the brake before making contact, but with slightly more restricted timing for us. Other fast landings can look cool, of course, but they should come with some kind of fall damage. Prototype's combat was certainly elevated by how it looked. Upon a slam, cars and people would fly up into the air or explode. Obviously, we can't have people getting turned into strawberry jam, but certainly lampposts, cars, windows, fire hydrants, and the ground itself should be getting torn up in the heat of battle. And that's only for a modern-day city. So, we've now covered flight and ranged combat, but we're still missing a large piece of the puzzle: melee. I think the only reason this isn't perceived as a big thing is because we've been content with having shit melee in Iron Man games since 2008. There are 2 ways I see of implementing melee combat that lives up to Iron Man's actual capability and doesn't suck from the player's perspective. The first is simple. No, we don't need to emulate the previous Iron Man games. We don't even need to iterate. Everyone else is doing it, so why don't we? Let's just do it Arkham style. No, seriously. Of course, Iron Man uses ranged attacks primarily, but that doesn't mean he needs to be far away. They're not that ranged attacks. So, to make this work, enemies are going to generally need to be spread out further away from the player. Instead of a punch, we're going for a repulsor blast. Of course, there can still be punches mixed in with the repulsors if enemies get up close. And like Arkham, Iron Man can still switch targets between hits in the combo. He has 2 hands free at almost all times, remember, so it might not be a bad idea to begin directional attacks in the animation of an ongoing attack, as Iron Man only needs to move his hand slightly to prime a blast. Don't think this would look cool? Well, first see how cool Arkham makes it look, and then look how cool Iron Man can be in CQC. Remember Civil War? Yeah, with repulsors and only an open hand needed to deliver a punch-like blow, Iron Man's animations can be both free and creative. Despite the back-to-back showdown at the end of Iron Man 2 being a close-quarters battle, both he and War Machine still relied on primarily ranged attacks. Counters may look a tad ridiculous if enemies are only going for a small punch 1 or 2 at a time, but I don't think having giant blue flashes is the way to go. Instead, have enemies heavily telegraph attacks, such as leaping up in the air or pulling their arms back, each punctuated by obvious visual effects. And perhaps instead of a specific counter button, you merely steer Iron Man in the correct direction to deal with the targets in question. The major problem with this idea is that for it to work, the enemies still need to be relatively close to Iron Man. Otherwise, target switching is going to be a nightmare. In all his previous games, and in a reasonably sized open world, playing fields are very large indeed. That brings me on to idea 2, dynamic melee. This way, simply holding down the button for the weapon you want to fire at close range will dynamically perform melee moves if the target's close enough. Looking at the back-to-back fight scene in Iron Man 2, we can see how that might work. War Machine uses his machine guns for the majority of the carnage, but when they get close enough, he kicks them away. The idea of this system is that you can use your 3 typically ranged weapons effectively up close, without having to aim them, which means melee can work without there being multiple enemies to engage up close at a time. And I think the exact same counter system could work here too. You simply steer Iron Man towards the target. Only problem is, against fewer numbers, countering enemies would be extremely easy, which is why I think incorporating every weapon type into countering would be a great idea. Some attacks can only be countered effectively with one of the 3 weapons. One of the other weapons only prevents damage to both combatants, and the final weapon will fail to counter and you will be damaged. So it's kinda like rock, paper, scissors. With enemies repeatedly mixing up what attack they employ, requiring different weapons to counter, and with 2, 3, or 4 enemies, the player would have to be skilled to come out unscathed. The next major question is how to encourage the player to use melee. There are 2 ways that come to mind of encouraging Iron Man to get closer to his targets with enemy design. The first is to give an enemy more dangerous attacks when Iron Man is far enough away, such as highly aggressive heat-seeking missiles. And the second is to simply make some enemies far less vulnerable to Iron Man's weapons at range. Probably by dodging, since being more resistant to missiles than punches might be a tad immersion breaking. Forcing the player to use only one option might be quite annoying though, so I certainly don't think it should be impossible for these enemies to be killed at range, and through more creative means you could lead a heat-seeking missile on a chase and make like Batman by using it to take out the guy who fired it. That wraps up how I'd like combat to work in an Iron Man video game. I would also consider a suit energy system, much like the ones in Iron Man Wii and 360. This was a system that allowed you to optimize your suit's power in one of weapons, armor, and thrusters, by sacrificing power in the others. It could be used to balance, and even dramatically raise the skill ceiling. But balancing such a system would require an insane amount of testing. I don't even know if it's worth considering, but I do know it's probably not worth boring you to tears by talking about it. If you have any suggestions or disagree with any of my ideas, be sure to post them in the comments, because you never know. Someone with the resources and know-how might end up reading it. The only thing we've yet to tackle is narrative. I think we've established that Iron Man needs to be allowed to cause carnage, and since he is a hero, we can't have a peaceful New York setting. I suggested something like Just Cause, but the problem with that is it kneecaps the story, because Iron Man is also Tony Stark. Tony Stark can't be the billionaire genius if he's in some remote area far away from his workshop and everything. Pepper or any other Iron Man characters are very unlikely to follow him into a war zone, so we could have the setting relatively close to home, which allows him to interact with characters in person and upgrade his suit in his workshop. We could go with the Assassin's Creed route by having a pseudo hub area at home, and allowing you to go into the main world whenever you want. So in our game, you're going to be able to fly back home at your leisure. This could work, but it would require a very good bit of writing to justify flying away from the combat all the time to interact with characters as Tony. If each of these home sequences was made very exciting, perhaps like a home invasion Iron Man 3 style, it could work. If we aren't going for this, we could take some inspiration from Spider-Man Web of Shadows, my personal favourite Spider-Man game. If we have the narrative start out as a peaceful New York, and do any combat sequences in a training simulation, then have New York be attacked and the city evacuated, we can easily allow Iron Man to go mental within the city limits, and have Stark Tower right there for Tony stuff. So the two options I see working are having home turf attacked, or using the home area as a hub that you can come back to from the main area at will. At these hub areas, other than interacting with characters, you should be able to upgrade your suit. Iron Man has hundreds of suits, and modeling, animating, and creating unique attacks for each one would be frankly impossible. So I think having a customizable suit is going to be the way to go. Colors, effects, and visual armor pieces for each of the limbs, the chests, and the helmet should be up for grabs in some form. Customization should be restricted within reason, at least for the duration of the main story, because running around with pink suits might unintentionally cheapen the experience. I think that having the player start out with the classic red and gold would be best from a narrative perspective. When it comes to gameplay effect and progression, for all of the suit upgrades like abilities and attacks, I don't think there's any reason not to use a classic skill point system like in the Arkham games. The weapons, on the other hand, could perhaps be purchased with currency and heavily vary throughout the upgrade path, just like Iron Man Wii. You've got pulse rifles and all sorts of different miniguns, you've got totally different types of missiles ranging from Bloodhound to the micro-nuclear thunderbolts, and then you've got the repulsors which vary in color, damage, travel speed for the projectile versions, and rate of fire. Iron Man 2 tried to be a little more immersive with a multifaceted upgrade system that affected your suit's internals. Only problem was, it was crap. So, for our game, I think having something like it, only to upgrade the suit energy through the arc reactor, and health through the armor material, along with the simplest of stat boosts, would keep things immersive and simple. You can collect materials as quest rewards or buy them off a market, and then craft them up Dragon Age Inquisition style to make the reactor or the material, which gives the stat boosts perfect for you. You'd just need a UI that shows how simple the system is, rather than Inquisition's total mess. And that concludes the meat of the video, because I can't really go into detail on the narrative. If anyone is able to get the license, I kinda doubt they'll have much creative freedom with regards to narrative. In the unlikely scenario they do, I think touching on Tony's alcoholism and perhaps anxiety issues, not spending too much time on the relationship with Pepper, and focusing on creating a really good villain would make for a solid story. Perhaps do the Mandarin similar to how it was done in Iron Man 3, but then not ruin it halfway through. War Machine could and should have a presence. As for any Stark Industries and Tony's life sections, I do think they can work in the game, but only if they're not boring. I'm talking engaging dialogue, fast pacing, and always staying on interesting topics. No, oh my god you ate a sandwich without me's. For an MCU tie-in, the only scenario that could work here is if Marvel ask a game studio to mop up their mess with the Mandarin situation. But then there's the issue of getting Robert Downey Jr., and where it fits into the timeline. They did allow Insomniac to do what they wanted with Spider-Man, and I think that's the best hope there is. Again, if you have any suggestions, please do comment. So that is how I would direct an Iron Man game. Iron Man's been my favourite superhero ever since the movie in 2008, so I played all the games religiously no matter how bad they were, and I wish that one day we might get a game that can sit amongst Batman Arkham and the best Spider-Man games. Thank you for your time. I have a Patreon, Discord, and Twitter if my dumbass remembers to post the links down below.